cool. Cloud it is. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to January 5th, 2022 meeting of SIG Auth. Let's get started. Looks like we have a few items on the agenda. Let's start with announcements. This is a reminder that KEPs targeting 124 should be ready for review by mid-January. I know there are a few KEPs that are being worked on right now. Feature freeze is expected by end of the month. So anything you want to get in, please be sure to make progress towards approval in the last 2 weeks. All right, let's get started. Any other announcements before I move on? All right, going into our discussion topics. First one is KMS observability related questions. This came out of the meeting we had between Mo, myself, and a few others who were talking about the KMS enhancement specifically for observability. And I think there was a question regarding a mission request, why a mission request is generating its own UID instead of using Audit ID. And I think this was the code that we were looking at. Mo, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I think I just, we didn't know the history of this code. So I don't know if like David or anyone else on the call has context on why a different UID was used, or just maybe we have some rules that are not necessarily written down somewhere about how we think about these UIDs.
So the purpose of the UID sent to admission was to make sure that the admission webhook was actually paying attention to the request we sent, and we weren't getting a cached response back. So the only purpose of this UID was to make sure that the admission webhook had inspected the request that we sent. So coupling it to something like Audit ID wasn't really relevant. In particular, Audit ID has a lifespan of the request. So if I submit a request to the API server, that Audit ID is going to be used for the lifetime of that request, but there can be multiple invocations of admission during the handling of that request. Like if it's a patch request and there's a conflict going to etcd, it'll actually reapply the patch and retry admission internally multiple times. So it's not a one-to-one request to admission relationship. So that was really the only purpose of the UID going to admission in the first place.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess what I would ask is, has there been any requests to help correlate Kubernetes audit logs with invocations of like admission webhooks?
I'm not sure. So the admission webhook can return information that gets included in the audit logs. So admission webhooks can return audit annotations, and those get included. Are you asking about correlating like the audit log with webhook invocations, or requests with webhook invocations?
I guess really the audit log. So the reason this question came up at all is we were trying to figure out exactly what is the correct or currently preferred way of including some kind of metadata through like API flows to make it clear like what caused something to happen. So for in this particular case with KMS, right, like why is the KMS plugin being invoked? Like what is the relation, right? And to me, the initial gut was that, well, if I could correlate a Kubernetes audit log to the KMS invocation, that would help me understand, right? So like Mo tried to create this pod. That's why this KMS plugin, or probably Mo tried to create the secret. That's why the KMS plugin was invoked. And it's okay if the KMS plugin got invoked like 3 times or whatever because of internal retries or whatever. But just like, I want to be able to say like, this is the reason. In our conversations around this, we also saw that there's like some brand new tracing code with the open telemetry stuff, and that looked interesting, but that's in alpha, so it was unclear to us exactly like if we want to basically include some kind of ID that we pass to KMS and wire it all through, like or something of that equivalence, what should we do? And if it's the Kubernetes audit ID, then how can we like make it more reliable and more not under user control?
Okay, so the admission stuff was not exactly. It was just sort of like you were inspecting other UID things that were associated with the request. Okay. Yeah, the tracing stuff I'm not as familiar with. I kind of reviewed the plumbing of it, but I would definitely point you to David or like SIG instrumentation if you wanted to know like plans for that in terms of like getting it to beta or whether it would be suitable to use this way.
The tracing is something I also didn't look deeply in. Daniel did the review of that giant PR that merged for the alpha feature, so I'm not very familiar with it.
I think it hooks into the context, and like anywhere the context gets passed, I think it will propagate. It was verified.
The KMS plugin uses it doesn't use HTTP, right? We don't use HTTP between API server and KMS plugin.
No, but neither does API server to etcd, and it got plumbed to etcd. So I know that there is facility for like plumbing it to gRPC clients and things like that.
Yeah, I guess that's what I mean is we have to decide how to carry that request ID. Although if it is gRPC, then maybe there's something already built.
Yeah, I don't think we're particularly opinionated. What we want to do is make sure that we're consistent with where the project is going and not invent some random new way of doing a thing.
What if inventing random new ways is consistent with what we've done?
I mean, yes, you are technically right, Jordan.
Well, for the purpose of this, though, you can't reuse the same audit ID twice, or you no longer know whether it's responding to the first attempt or the second. And when you do something like a mutating admission webhook, where you are intentionally calling it twice, it's important to be sure you got the correct one the second time.
Yeah, I'm also not sure if the tracing stuff is exactly what you want, since the tracing, my understanding is that it tends to be sort of like it operates on a subset, like a sample, like 1 out of every X% of requests. And it sounds like what you're wanting is a much more deterministic, like ironclad, this happened because of that chain that you can follow from one thing to another.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I would ask there is, I mean, so certainly like we can go investigate the semantics of the tracing stuff and try to see if it fits what we were thinking. What I'm gathering so far is don't worry about the Kubernetes audit ID. I guess what I would ask there is, if I'm a KMS plugin maintainer, author, production person, and I do see invocations of my KMS plugin and have some IDs associated with them. Say we did exactly what admission does and just generate a unique UUID per invocation of like, I guess the KMS plugin or something. Would we want, like as a, for example, would we want to try to somehow plumb that back into the audit event using like audit annotations. So that way, if you wanted to correlate those things, you could in a way that can't be spoofed by the user.
Maybe.
The state of the art for logging is pretty much, right? You would pass the original audit ID, and then your KMS plugin would write out a audit log entry or just a plain log entry saying, I'm working on a request that I named UID X, and it's in service of request, the original request UID Y. Tracing lets you link the spans, but like Jordan said, not every trace is sampled.
Yeah. So I guess then what I would ask is, so if we're saying tracing doesn't have the right semantics, I saw the audit ID chain issue that Tim had opened, which is basically the crux of it is audit ID can be controlled by an end user by them just setting the header. I guess what I wanted to ask is, why do we allow them to do that? And can we not allow them to do that? So that way we can trust it.
How would you distinguish who said it?
I mean, so
Like generated internally, like we do for ignition.
right. Well, audit ID is generated internally. It's just that if it was already set as a header, it'll just use whatever value was passed in. So if the client doesn't set one, we do just generate a random thing and send it through.
Yeah, I don't remember. I'd like to dig into the history of that and see if that was discussed. 'Cause I don't. That sounds like something I would raise my eyebrows at, and I don't remember getting convinced.
Yeah, it totally does, right? Tim had mentioned that maybe it was related to aggregated API servers. If Rita, if you want to open the linked issue.
This one.
Yeah, the audit ID chain. But if it's related to that, that seems also suspect, because the connections to aggregated API servers have strong MTLS associated with them. So like you should piggyback off of that and use that to create some kind of trust anchor, not just arbitrarily trust it.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like the questions are around nailing down whether we want the audit ID to be able to be dictated the way it is today. That's one question. If that becomes more trustworthy, the next question would be, would we want to plumb that down to the storage layer, make use of that in the storage layer for something like this? And if not, then what would we want to use as an alternative to allow correlating stuff at the storage layer to stuff in the audit log?
Yeah, basically, that's basically this entire set of questions. Those two questions basically sum them up.
Okay. I think Tim would be a good person to ask if he can remember.
And I'll also say that we do expect a lot of what the KMS plugin is expected to do or asked to do by the API server is done so by system operations and the loopback client. Like definitely most read operations to the Kube API server are not going to be associatable with anything that we would put in an audit log. So I don't know how far you're going to get if you want to be able to track everything back.
Sorry, what do you mean by that? Why not?
So like for like something that is served from a cache in the Kube API server, we would not expect every read request to like a secret to actually initiate a KMS plugin operation. Primarily, like initial load would be done by the loopback client in the Kube API server, and then subsequent reads would be done from memory and not require KMS plugin interaction with the KMS plugin. So There will be things in the audit log, reads of secrets that do not have, that do not require interaction with the KMS plugin, and vice versa. There will be things in the KMS plugins log that were did not produce an audit event.
Because they weren't triggered by an API request, they were triggered by an internal like watch cache load.
Right.
Okay.
And can y'all remind me, so when a client does a live get against the API server, I'm trying to remember, when does that hit the watch cache versus going straight to etcd?
Live get goes to etcd. You can opt into a cached get that will hit the watch cache if it is populated. But even apart from hitting the watch cache, like if you do a live get from etcd and the server loads the encrypted data and the data encrypting key is still in the cache, it will use that without talking to the KMS again. So the server has the ability to cache data encrypting keys.
Right. Okay, yeah. So I think that one is okay. I think what we were looking for is when the KMS plugin is invoked, can we figure out why? So it does seem like for live operations using like kubectl, like a normal end user would, that's fine. It's only the less the internal stuff within the API server that the loopback client is doing to fill caches or whatever that might hit KMS, but
well, I mean, when the server starts, if it fills its watch cache with all secrets, which it does, then at that point, it's going to request all of the data encrypting keys. So the first and most likely requests to KMS are not going to be associated with particular requests. And like when the server starts up, it'll load all of those. Now on subsequent writes, when it's hitting KMS to encrypt, those will be correlated with the write requests. Anyway, and we're 20 minutes in and we probably want to time box this. But if that gives us like next questions, next steps, that's probably where I'd go from here.
Anish, Rita, did you guys have anything else you want to ask before? I do see we have 2 other items on the agenda.
No, I think with it reading from the cache, I think that is where the audit ID chain might help, like where we can correlate from the request all the way to the end to end. But otherwise, I think just generating a UID right at the API server before we make the request to KMS plugin seems like the right fit for now. So that is what we initially want to correlate. So then maybe we can expand from there and see if you also want to plug it into the audit logging.
Maybe I don't know, like I just thinking through what like the stuff that Mike and Jordan have brought up, and I'm questioning how useful it would be, I guess. So I want to make sure that, you know, if we're building a bunch of plumbing, it actually is valuable plumbing. But that's fine. We can keep thinking through this. Rita, did you have anything?
No, I do kind of, I need to think about what Mike said a little bit more. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I think we're ready to move to the next.
Okay. James, do you want to talk about the 124 release team stuff?
Yeah, hello. Sorry, can people hear me? Cool. So my name is James Laverack. I'm the release lead for Kubernetes 124. I just wanted to take the time to come say hello and introduce myself to you. I just really wanted to make myself available if you had any questions or anything you wanted to bring up about the release. You've already talked about the release deadlines. Just to add to that, the release as a whole starts on Monday, so we should start accepting KEPs for tracking then. And our current draft for the full schedule, which we hope to finalize by the end of the week, has enhancements freeze on week 4, which is actually on Thursday, the 3rd of February, and with the production readiness soft freeze the week before on Thursday, the 27th of January. So that's what the dates are looking like right now. We'll have those confirmed in an email at the start of next week, but that's what things are looking like. Yeah, that's all ready. Has anyone had any particular questions about the release or anything happening this time around?
I know there were a couple questions in the retrospective about whether we were going to continue using the tracking spreadsheet, which required sort of manual update, and some of the release team found difficult, or if we were going to try to do things off of a query from the enhancements issues. Has there anything changed there?
Nothing has changed for 124. Everyone hates tracking spreadsheet. Don't worry. We all want to get rid of it. It's just what we replace it with is a larger question. There is an effort within SIG release to get that changed, but nothing's changing for 124. It's the same as it was before.
Okay.
Now.
I mean, for each SIG, there's normally like a small single-digit number of things we need to add to it, so it's not terrible. Just wanted to know where we should be putting things in the next week or two.
Yeah, it will be putting the spreadsheet as previous releases.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you, James. Adam, would you like to talk about the CSI ephemeral volume pot security emission control doc?
Sure. So speaking of KEPs, this is a draft KEP that was discussed, I think, in SIG Auth before the holiday break. So just as a quick refresher, the general idea, and this is something that would most likely be sponsored by SIG Storage, is that we would be adding an emission plugin, which allows CSI drivers that provide the ephemeral volume capability to sort of declare themselves safe for a given pod security profile using either an annotation or a label. And then the admission plugin on pod admission would decide if the pod should be admitted based on inspecting the CSI driver's annotation or label. That's the general high-level idea. I believe, and unfortunately I wasn't able to attend the previous meeting, we left things off. We wanted to take an assessment of which CSI drivers might be considered unsafe, which is kind of the reason where this KEP idea came from, and consider potential either the scope of the problem or consider alternatives. So I just wanted to follow back up on this and discuss potential next steps and sort of where our findings are.
So Jan did answer the question. He provided very quickly examples of, I believe it was Azure as for instance, of one that was not safe. Not sure whether Jordan ended up creating the alternative list of all the safe ones.
No, I had was landing on Michelle and Jan for that. So I think my posture is still that I don't want to encourage people to create unsafe ephemeral CSI drivers. And I don't like the idea of not being able to look at a pod and know outside the context of a particular cluster whether it fits in a given pod security standard level. Both of those seem not great.
Well, we did leave it to be made tighter by other admission plugins. So I think that latter point will exist no matter what you do. Because
but if it's a like a built-in admission plugin like that there's a difference between, yeah, we installed custom admission stuff on this cluster and it's making policy decisions. Like that's always going to be possible. There's a difference between that and this is another built-in admission thing that gloms onto the same level labels.
All right. Well, I'm still interested in an alternative list. Jan actually, Storage Jan did come back and answer the question. But if there is a different list that says, no, this isn't really a problem, that would be interesting.
For the Azure one, I'm also curious. I remember there being a variety of things with Azure where sort of what I would have considered important boundaries to safely isolate namespaces and things were not really considered problematic by the Azure team. And so I'm wondering if that specific one is more a mismatch in expectations of cluster isolation instead of saying, nope, people running on Azure have strong expectations of namespace isolation, and this particular CSI driver is confounding them. I don't, it's been several years since I looked at it, but things like secrets being written to namespaces containing storage credentials that were surprising to me for someone who was wanting to isolate namespace permissions. That was pretty particular to Azure, the built-in Azure driver.
I didn't look any further than the link was a Kubernetes SIGs link.
Yeah.
Do you remember which driver that was? Because I think there's a few different. Is it Azure Files?
The one that Jan linked was Kubernetes SIGs, Azure CSI driver, Azure Files CSI driver.
Yeah,
Okay.
the CSI one I hadn't looked at, but the Azure file, I forget which one was creating the secrets. I can dig it up. We don't have to block here. I'll add a.
Oh, that'd be great.
At any rate, I would be very interested in seeing the list of CSI drivers, if there are others that Jan didn't even have in his list that were also vulnerable, and then the decision about whether to fix them or to ban them or to leave them broken. I think I'd like to look at that list before trying to make a choice.
So is this an action item for?
So I'm willing to take Jan's word. I think Jordan wanted to try to change the CSI drivers rather than protect the cube clusters in the current state, which is also valid. But
Gotcha.
if anyone else would like to have opinions, it seems like they would want that information. I think Jordan needs it either way.
Yeah, I mean, the current posture came like when we were looking at the pod security standard stuff and trying to decide what to do with ephemeral CSI drivers. And we went and talked to storage folks, and the feedback from them was that there were a few known ones that had similar characteristics to the built-in volume plugins that you could specify, like
I guess I'd be interested in hearing Michelle's opinion.
Sort of arbitrary connection.
Yeah, I remembered different feedback from them, more in line with what Jan wrote in the doc, where he says, yes, this is a real problem to address. So, yeah.
Okay.
So David, sounds like, are you okay with following up with SIG storage?
I think we already did, and they answered yes, it's a problem and we should protect it. I think Jordan has a request for a second opinion, which is fine, but I think he should own the action for that. I mean, I've got Jan right there, and
I take what Jan says as this is a problem. It's a problem for the driver. And so if you want to use that driver, you need to protect it. I don't think it's an issue for Kubernetes to build in policy to protect against. I don't disagree that some drivers are exposing things they shouldn't. My recollection of when we talked to storage was that the guidance would be for ephemeral drivers not to expose those things. And building in policy to let them expose those things and then lock it down is not going to push drivers in the direction that was previously discussed of ephemeral CSI drivers being safe to expose to pod authors. So I'm fine setting up something or sending something out and starting the discussion. It sounds like the guidance for driver authors that was previously discussed didn't happen to clarify that when you make an ephemeral driver, pod authors can directly access all the parameters you expose. And currently, and by default, that is not safe to do. And so current drivers that are doing that are not safe and have an issue. And I'm not convinced that it is Kubernetes issue to fix by continuing to let them expose unsafe stuff. Anyway, I'll start that and try to figure out what the next step is.
All right. Any other items in the agenda that y'all want to talk about, but it's not here yet? If not, I guess we can look at the CI Flakes. Does this look familiar to folks?
Jordan, is it me or this service account OIDC discovery thing shows up way more often than anything else in our Flakes?
It does. I had asked Michael to look at it, and he dug into it to the point where it hit networking issues. I think there was a networking visibility config thing, and I lost track of where it went from there. I think he was going to ask the networking folks what the deal was with the config in that job, but I don't know if that ever happened.
Okay.
Let me ping him real quick and see if he can pick that up. Or hand it off and get acknowledgement.
Okay. There are other issues, Rita, that you see other than the service account thing?
Let me see. think that's it.
What's the difference between the flaky OIDC discovery #2 and the like one that looked completely broken, which is this top one?
I just linked to the issue for the completely broken one. That looks like a configuration with the job, and it got routed to the cloud provider folks because I don't know why. That's where the configuration seemed to lead. Yeah, I will try to ping Walter and see if that makes sense to assign to him, or if he should route it to someone who understands the config. It had to do with the detection of the self-addressable network address for the API server. So it was like a network visibility issue. So it's not really related to the feature, it just happened to be surfaced by this test.
On a slightly more meta note, it seems like we rarely cover flakes in the meeting. Is there more process around that, or do we just kind of let them slide if we don't get to them?
I would say I think they fill the shoulder where we have time. Generally, the tests that SIG Auth owns are a lot less flaky than other SIGs, I would like to think, because the majority of the test coverage for stuff in Kubernetes core is unit tests and integration tests. But so I don't really have a problem with kind of leaving it lower on the agenda and not having dedicated time. There is a triage meeting Monday mornings that covers like bugs and maybe stuff more urgent that does not go over test flakes.
Yeah, we don't go over test flakes. We only look at issues. Unless they're created as issues, I guess.
Yeah, I think if we were causing more problems, maybe Jordan can tell me if this is wrong, but I think that if we were causing more problems or breaking more submits and stuff, it would be like higher priority to focus on, but the current state is pretty reasonable.
That is generally true. I think if stuff gets bad enough, it shows up in the top flakes list and it gets reported.
And then it does get covered.
The intermittent ones aren't usually bad enough to get reported, and also aren't necessarily clear that it is our issue. Like if one of our tests fails, once a week, sometimes we'll dive into that, and like a bunch of jobs failed in that run, and like something overloaded the server or something. So what we tend to look for is stuff that bumps up into the top flakes list, or that we happen to just notice ad hoc when we're doing PRs and stuff. It's like, oh, I seem to hit this one a few times, and we'll open an issue. The thing that I really want to catch in these reviews is like the permanently failing stuff that just is sort of a noisy floor. So like the OIDC thing is a good example. Like I want to try to get that cleaned up and clean up permanently failing stuff.
So is this item currently being assigned to anybody?
It's on Walter, but I'm not sure if that's correct. So I'm going to ping him and
Okay.
see if he can triage it or route it, or say I don't know and unassign himself. And we'll try to figure out something else.
Okay. Cool. So this should really be in progress or something, I guess.
It's waiting on other SIGs. I mean, this is like a cluster config issue with this test job. Like it doesn't know its own network address correctly. So that's not our test's responsibility. I think pending other SIGs are not actionable. I don't know.
Okay.
I guess pending other SIGs, it is actionable, just not by us.
Right. Okay. Moving on. Was there, I don't think that there was anything else, right? So did you guys see anything else that jumped out?
No, this looks good.
Okay. All right. I think next is the test grid. Sorry, my computer's slow. Anish, did you want to comment on this or?
No, I mean, the one job that was failing last week was because we have image scan periodically, and then there was a image vulnerability, but we already fixed that, so it should be fine. But the other one was just one flake yesterday. But apart from that, mostly everything has been passing.
Okay. Cool. I think that's it. Any other topics that anyone wants to bring up? No. All right. Thanks, everybody, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year's.
Bye.
Yeah, take care.